because you want to make sure that you have all of the components. Now, I'm going to focus on NIH grants because there's a specific sort of framework for them. And, I think and so you have to do those sorts of things. But there are some areas that, let's say, if you're writing a foundation grant or something for the ANRS for France or the Humboldt grants for, Germany, that you will actually want to follow their specifications. And if you're writing a grant, let's say for let's say an implementation science grant for, let's say, a UK group or a Canadian group or something like that, you also want to use their terminology. So we use implementation and dissemination science. They're going to use other sorts of terminology for this because when they start to review stuff, their heads start spinning. And I'll tell you, I just recently helped somebody put together, their grant. And I said, let me, do some of the writing. Let me help with some of that. And of course, they, like knowledge transfer, and it's a perfectly good term, but it just doesn't fit into my sort of writing style. And so we had to go back and really fix some of that. There's a couple of things in general. For a big R01 grant, I've timed it out. It's 300 hours. 300 hours I spend. Now I have a high hit rate. I get almost everything funded. Not always on the first time, but it's about 300 hours, and I work a lot. And my style of putting it together is a little bit differently than others. And I will give you some of my own personal insights in terms of the way that I do it, but that will be important. Try to create a timeline. And the one thing that often happens when you're writing a grant is, you are so focused on getting the specific aims and the research strategy and all that together, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes into it. And then you sort of like wipe the sweat off your brow, and all of a sudden you've got all of these other documents. So make sure you create a checklist right up front so that you know that once you have something done or you're going to get something on a timeline that you do it. And part of that, and this is actually a place where I fail, and Dato here, he can verify, getting feedback. I managed to get feedback from my co-investigators or mentors and stuff like that, but I don't give people enough time. I am one of these people who sort of spends a lot of time reading and synthesizing, and I do not a whole lot of writing early on. I put bits and pieces together, but I have to have it all worked out in my head. I create my figures very early on because I really believe that a picture paints 1,000 words. I have colleagues, when I read grants, when I review them, who it is absolutely dense with every word under the sun, and I have no breaks. If I don't have visual breaks, then, I am sort of disturbed by the way that you have to read it. Because remember, your reviewers, they're each going to have 8 or 10 grants to get through. And if your grant doesn't read well, and it doesn't look pretty. Now, I did graphics design, I was like the editor of my yearbook and stuff like that. So I care the way that a grant looks. I'm going to show you some examples of that. But what I would say that is really important, especially for those of you who are going to do mentored grants like a D43, I would make sure that your mentor has a lot of time to reflect and give feedback back so that you can get it through. The other thing that I will say that's probably the single most important thing, I don't even write the research strategy until my specific aims are tight. I feel like it's like the elevator speech. If you can get everything onto that one specific aims page, you know what the rest of it's going to be. You're going to have to hit the significance. You're going to have to hit the innovation, but all of that should come out in some way in your specific aims page. And then how you do the work, which is your strategy, beyond that. And then, once you decide actually what it is you're doing, then you can think about what the human subjects are. Now, one of the big problems in writing a grant, for some people, they can't fill up the 12 pages. I feel like I could write 40, but you don't get to write 40. And so you have to think about, when you really want to give people details, think about what you can move to other sections They don't like you to put a lot of stuff, but I get a lot of stuff into my budget justification. And I get a lot of stuff into my human subjects. So like if I would have to say, to ethically do this correct, we have limited it to the following criteria. And then I might put all of my justification for eligibility there. And I might just list A, B, C, D, and E, but I've done my justification down there. So I'm happy to move things along, which means that you might write it in longhand. You get to 15 pages and then you say, okay, this can move over here. If you have an internal review process, we have a process at the university where we can submit it to 3, NIH, funded scientists to do the review. I have to say, I don't do that anymore, but I try to have my colleagues who are writing with me to do that. But that's actually really helpful. One of the things that is really important is to be really clear and direct. Years ago, when I was sort of an early trainee, my mentor said, Rick, I believe that you are the worst writer that I've ever met in my life. And I think it was legitimate. Wasn't that I was a bad writer. I was a bad scientific writer. I was a Spanish literature scholar before going into medicine. And I wrote beautifully in Spanish and I wrote elegant things around literature. That's not the way we do science. You really try to be very clear. My sort of rule is if you have a sentence that's 3 lines long, it becomes 2 sentences. Really, has anybody read Hemingway? Hemingway is brief and concise and tells you exactly what to, it's not flowery. It's not going to make you feel like, you're sort of floating away in a Gabriel Garcia Marquez, sort of, or Federico Garcia Lorca, sort of, sort of writing style. You really want to think Hemingway as you're writing. And then the other sort of thing is tell a compelling story and know that you're compassionate about it. I had somebody, I don't know if it was in this group, who came up and said, you are just so passionate about your topics and stuff like that. You want to write the way you feel. I mean, when I read a scientific article where they state a bunch of facts to me, I want to stab my eyes out with an ice pick. I mean, because I'm not excited about it. Remember, your reviewers got 10 grants, and the one that gets them excited, everybody reads the abstract first. Am I interested? They read the specific aims. Do they have a good cause? And they said, now let's dig into the meat. Okay, so be realistic about what you're doing. Some people, that's why the specific aims, when they're really crisp and clear, they can tear you apart in the research strategy because you forget something, and invariably you do. But tell a story at the end of an important issue, whether it's how important it is. You can have something in sort of italics. We will address this by doing this, or this is important in this context. I give them something, a punchline at the end of some of those sections to be able to sort of get people excited about why this particular finding relates to something that we're going to address. So I call it relatability between that. I try to get right to the beginning and say why this is important. If Georgia has got the highest rate of substance use or people who inject drugs in the country, or in the world, I say Georgia has the highest rate of drug injection in the world, and then I'm going to go after it, right? So it's important. So if your study is not important and what you're going to do about it is going to be your innovation, all right? And then one of the things that that one of the PhD students yesterday, was it Miriam, who presented, was she did a scoping review. Your initial work is essentially a scoping review. And what you're doing is you're not just spurting out facts, but you're really identifying where there are gaps in your, in the search. So for instance, I'm doing a grant in Peru, and there's systematic reviews on, and where you can use systematic reviews, do use them when you can, that basically say that, decentralizing HIV care is an evidence-based practice. It's something that you really should do. It's endorsed by WHO, but it's a recommendation that has never been proven in an experimental design. So you say, okay, it's an evidence-based practice, but it really hasn't done that. We're going to fix that. We're going to do an experimental design. Know the gaps in your literature. Um, are you going to do something that's new and different? Well, one of the things that we've gotten some unfortunately, we published too many papers on nominal group technique. The last 4 or 5 years of my grants have had some nominal group technique, and people get excited about it. The democratization of this method, it's fast, it's quick, it's related to implementation science. I'll just go ahead and tell you, my new innovation is I do these asynchronous online focus groups, especially with people who are really busy, because they don't have time to come and meet with you. But they can do it online for 2 or 3 minutes. You fire a question back and forth. So finding innovative and new methods that get people, sort of excited, I think is something. If you're just doing the same old, when the readers do it, just say, okay, I've got another focus group that I'm just going to be bored to tears about. I mean, it might be a focus group, but then I say it's nominal group technique. We're doing something different. It's fast and it's quick, and it's going to give us things that are prioritized that we can focus on the important things as opposed to the unimportant things. What's innovative? Let's just say you have an evidence-based practice, but it's never been done with sex workers. All right, that's an innovation. You've moved something into a new area. One of the big innovations years ago is we used to have patient navigation. That was an evidence-based practice. Well, how do you apply it to peers? So 10 or 15 years ago, that was a big thing. Why do you have to have like a nurse or, a case manager, somebody with a trained degree or a social worker do this work whenever we can offset it? We can do it by task shifting. So that is a way that you sort of create some innovation around that. Are you doing it in a new population? Is your implementation strategy, we're not going to just do audit and feedback, but we're going to do audit and feedback with or without, training and coaching or something like that, so you can compare those sorts of things. And then I always go back to what it is at the end of the study. What do you want to do? Like, so for instance, in a decentralized care is recommended by everyone. But my question is, how do you do it? What is needed in order to do it the right way? Do you use it with coaching of the physicians? Do you do it with changing the way that the system actually works? Or do you need a combination of both of those? Because nobody knows how to do it. They just do it. They just say, we're going to move those patients out of HIV care. And you move that, but how do you do that? And why might that work in some settings and it's not? So I want to say, I want to tell people how to do decentralized care at the end of that, because then that becomes a product. So if you can think about what your science is doing that will result in a potential product that people can use, or are you creating new tools that people can do, then that's really important. And then, are you going to do something that is only meaningful for Georgia? I think it's important enough to say that it's important for Georgia. What might this mean? Let's say you're using something with people who inject drugs. It's really big here. It makes it more feasible to do the work because there's a lot of them. But are there some generalizable sorts of things that are related, to drugs? If you're dealing with opioids, or, if you happen to be, let's say, studying diphenhydramine, there's only a handful of places in the world, that do that. So that might be sort of a niche thing. But if you can say diphenhydramine is evolving and moving out of one country, and if you could learn about it in one so that you can help people address it proactively. So you want people to walk away with, at the end of the grant, what is it that you're going to do with this, as opposed to saying, I got those papers published and I'm on to my next grant. In reality, we move on to our next grant. One of the things that you can do, not at your level of the career, but at mine, is I really think about sort of long-term relationships and sort of building on it. So a competitive renewal where I will say, I learned all of this from the last 5 years. I'm writing a new grant to fill in where we found that there were difficulties or unanticipated sorts of things that are, part of that. You really need a good idea. If you think that you're just writing a ho-hum idea, it's not going to get people excited. People, even if you write an airtight grant, if it doesn't look as though it's important, you're still going to get those middle scores. And the NIH has sort of a crazy, did it come up the right way? Yeah. Um, did the, the NIH has sort of a crazy scoring system. A 1 is perfect and a 9 is, the end of the earth. You've fallen off a cliff. And so it's awful. And then, of course, they average them out. So scores might come down as a 15 or a 25. They become sort of a 2-level integer, but it comes from 1s and 2s from the voting. But your grant will never end up as a 1, 2, or a 3, typically, if your idea is not important, if it's not significant. As I said right at the very beginning, the specific aim for me is if you can really articulate that and get, excited. And by the way, anybody who wants copies of any of my grants that I publish, you can just have them as open access. I mean, I give them to everyone. I know a number of people who are like, "No, this is my intellectual property." There is, in my mind, there is no such thing as intellectual property. Once it's in the intellectual space, it's there. But I don't believe you can own ideas. I think you have to give them away. And yeah.
I think most of people are not familiar with the structure of NIH grant application. So specific aim, 12 pages, maybe just.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of stuff in these grants. So you have a project narrative, which is 3 sentences. And that's really what's going to go to the people in the federal government, the senators who kind of are looking at this to sort of say, oh, you're doing something really important that we care about. No reviewer cares about that. That's the NIH officials that do that. So that's always the last thing that I do when the grant goes in. Oh God, I got to write something stupid. But at that point, I've written enough and I've truncated it. Your 1-page specific aims is the piece de resistance. It is really exactly where the money is. Then there's a series of sections, which is if you're doing and there's a 1-page specific aim for almost every grant. Then the duration of the rest of the grant is depending on whether you're doing a smaller R grant, like an R21, or if you're doing a bigger grant, which is an R34, R01. And then the training grants are a little bit different. I didn't plan on talking about that, but I will. And that the sections that go into the next series of parts really are importance, where you do your sort of background and significance. So it's the significance, but that's really where you paint the story for important, because your scoring is for importance. And that really is going to come out in your background and significance. Then you have an innovation section. And if you really are doing something that's innovative that needs explaining, I mean, I remember getting back a reviewer's comment where I was providing the first mobile program in the world. And I didn't describe it. I just thought it was a really good idea and it was intuitive. And the reviewer said, this doctor thinks he can put a Good Humor ice cream truck on the street and everybody's going to come out there. I mean, I had some preliminary data. And, I learned that I might need to really write out my innovation. I used to just do them as bullet points. We're using the first mobile program linked to syringe services programs is all I wrote in my innovation. This is sort of new and novel. It can do potentially the following things is which I should have done. So you want your innovation to talk about what other people haven't done or a method that you're using that other people haven't done. You could say, people have developed guidelines using Delphi and this and these other sorts of things. We're going to do it a different way so that they see that you're bringing up a new technique. One of the things that I've managed to do in order to keep myself, alive is we're required, at least at my university, to take a sabbatical every 3 years. I go back and learn. I mean, I learned, decision science. I literally work harder during my sabbatical. Other people are taking vacation and writing papers and they're on the French Riviera. I'm taking classes and doing that because that's where your innovation is. So if you're a public health person and you take classes at the business school or in economics or something else, you bring in some of those tools so that it shocks the reviewers so that they're not seeing something that is something that they've already seen before. If you can introduce something new, you have to do it in a good sort of way because a lot of times you know it way too well. but you have to be able to sort of explain it. In your specific aims, you really paint the picture of your significance, the first section of your grant. Then you talk about your innovation. We are going to answer the question in this way, and we're going to do it through the following specific aims. If you have more than 3, people love to use the word overly ambitious. Make sure that the scope of your work, and this is one of the biggest problems for new investigators, is basically saying, I'm going to bite off all I can chew. Research is hard. It is a lot of attention. And I know that sometimes it looks easy. It is not easy, even for people who've done this for 40 years. And those need to be crystal clear. I mean, even today, I went back and I was preparing something for like the later talk. I reread my specific aims and I said, I'm going to rewrite them. I mean, of course, I would rewrite my name if I was allowed, but I love to edit and refine and to get it better. So I spent a lot of time there. Aim 1 is you either are going to do things sequentially. Remember, if you do things sequentially, if you fail with the first one, your second one will get you into trouble. And they'll say, well, what if your first experiment doesn't work? So if you're in a lab and you're going to be looking at whether A does B and it doesn't work, and the second aim is related to now studying B, you're done. So you need to have contingencies, all right? That's really important. Aim 2 is the core of your work, and aim 3 is typically how you pull it all together. So for instance, I might do, let's say in a implementation grant, I might, if I'm using EPIS, which is exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment, my first activity might be an exploration phase. What are the barriers and facilitators, inner, outer contexts and stuff like that? So I'm getting at whatever my framework is, I'm going to do it. The second one is often an implementation for an R21. It might be a pilot study. R21s are 6 pages. You do not need to have your sort of, your preliminary results. R21s are exploratory by nature. They're not just a small grant. There's also RO3s. They're like $100,000, and for 2 years. I don't write them because it's a lot of work for very little money, but that's doesn't mean they shouldn't be done. And then a lot of times, once you do your implementation, I might throw on a third aim, which is going to be, let's say, doing a cost effectiveness analysis or something like that. And so that's tying it all together. What does this mean if we sort of find that we sort of reduce mortality by scaling up opioid use disorder? What might that look like for a whole country or for the globe in order to do that? So you sell your idea in the abstract, and the specific aims is you galvanize it. All right, sell it and galvanize it. Your abstract can be 30 lines. Specific aims, 1 page. Your research strategy, either 6 or 12 pages. And then the third part, so we did background and significance, we did innovation. Your research strategy is, what are you doing? And justifying. What are your measures? What's the data? And I don't want to go through all of that. And then I try to end up at the end with sort of saying, what are the implications of all this? One of the things that each of you should do, and I would say if you're like if you're missing Jen's paper, Lancet gives you a really important heuristic for thinking about how you're going to submit your paper. And I apply it to grants. What was known before your study? What did you learn, from your study? And with all of the information that you've learned, what are the future directions and where we should go? All right. That's really sort of a summary. And I actually use that when I do the writing workshop as a way that I get people ready, for their talk. Where you're going to get the money. The money shots are significance, or, importance. I'm sorry, it's going to be importance, and they're going to be innovation. What are you doing that's different? If you're doing the same old thing, you will get lost in that. And so your impact is mostly done by whether it's significant and whether it's feasible. And we heard one of the things in the student assessments that, when we're trying to work with NGOs, it's just not feasible. So you need to demonstrate that whatever it is that you're going to do, if you're doing a laboratory experiment, that, that it's going to be feasible, your lab's going to have the reagents, it's going to have all of these other sorts of things, that there's other successes going on. If you're going to work with an NGO, let's say with people who inject drugs, Miriam Study, she's going to need a letter from 15 NGOs perhaps that says that we're willing to work with you and we love this idea. So feasibility, which is basically saying we are committed to that. Now, I will say, and this is not in the talk, when there are letters of support or letters of agreement that go on, I don't let the agency write them. I write every single one of them because I want them to align with what I'm saying that we're going to be doing with them. And of course, they have to sign them, but I write them. If they want to write a letter saying, oh, I'm happy to work with you, you're such nice people, we're happy to work with you. We will allow our people to be trained. We will encourage, we will ensure, is even better, that, that you will be able to train them in doing sort of screening instruments. And we are committed to finding ways through your research to be able to link them to care, et cetera. Make sure as the issue is focused, bring something new that is a method and that you can answer it. Stay close to your expertise, and if you can't, have co-investigators who are providing that expertise. And that will be relayed in the contributors within the research strategy of who's there and what expertise they bring. You build out that same thing in their bio sketches, and I reiterate it in the budget. They're going to see it 3 times. Repetition is your friend across all of these different things. Some people look at my budget justification and they have 2 pages. My budget justification is 20 pages. I write out everything so that there is no ambiguity. Now, some people who read it and like you make changes here, but you don't go back there, you got to go back and fix that because you can find some expertise that will get you into trouble. The other thing is that if you're trying to offer up something that doesn't fit into any of the Institute's priorities, talk to the project officer and say, we're interested in doing this. I've had people say, I was trying to do some hepatitis C work many years ago, and they said, Rick, we really think that that's really interesting stuff, but we're just not interested in it. We're not going to fund it if you get a perfect score. I'm like, I'm not pissing away my time. 300 hours is something I don't want to give away. So anyway, talk to people in advance if you're sort of on the borderline or it doesn't seem to be a good fit. The 5 scoring criteria, they're going to give you an overall score, which is not adding up these individual things because they mean different things. Your significance is going to get a score. That's where you're getting importance. Your innovation is going to get a score. Your approach, which is your research strategy, I probably should have put arrows to where you're going to find that. And this is the place where most people get killed. And it's the devil's in the details that you have to get right. The investigative team, most people don't forget to bring, sort of experts to the table, but boy, I'm actually a fairly good qualitative researcher. And somebody said, oh, Dr. Altice, he's a doctor. He knows nothing about qualitative research. He's a physician. He sees patients in the hospital. We know that. And I just did not put in that I've got, kind of a gazillion publications in qualitative and mixed methods. So the next time I resubmitted, I basically said, Dr. Altice is the qualitative and mixed methods research. And then I referred to the biosketch. And so you get there. And then the environment. Are you working in a place that's going to but I would say that using it for language issues to clarify your language and stuff like that is okay. But get a good editor to read it through, make sure that you're not using, words. One of my Ukrainian students, he uses the word target and it means it's a direct translation from something else, but it's not the right word to be using, in the field. And so I would say that make sure that there's somebody, who is doing that. You cannot use different colors in your text and everything, but I will italicize really important things like a summary at the end of a paragraph or something like that. I use depictions, I use graphics, picture paints 1,000 words. And your graphics need to look pretty. I mean, if you're putting together a sloppy thing that looks in there, I mean, people care about that. They won't ever write it in their review, but when you sit on a committee, you'll have someone say, something, it looks like it's sloppy to me. And they won't write in there, but like, like if you're using Arial in one part and another part's in Georgia, it means that you cut and pasted from something else. All right. And so, one of the last things I do with anything is I go through and I hit, select all, Arial 11. And then of course, the problem is your tables can be in like 9 and 10. And so you have to go back and fix those, but make sure that you haven't done anything. Because I mean, what you're doing when you're cutting and pasting is you're auto plagiarizing, right? If you're short of space and you're like using these big long words, you can use some abbreviations. Do not overuse. Limit your abbreviations. And what I do is I put a legend up in the corner of my grant right at the beginning to define them right up front. And of course, the first time that you put them in there, make sure that you do it. There is a certain strategy to repeating ideas to bring them back to the idea. We are doing this because this is important. So do that. And I talked a little bit about making it look nice. If you have a figure or a table, label it. This is table 1. This is what it shows. All right. This is the figure. And one of the things that you're thinking about is, especially for junior investigators, you've not put together, you've not read other people's grants. But like I said, there is a certain amount of fatigue. So always think that if you've got a reviewer, it takes me on average 8 hours to review one grant. That's how long I spend on each grant. If you are my 10th grant, you are my 10th day of punishment. That's not important. Here's another thing that I really needed to put in picture. So I was really doing some work on stigma. And I used a framework that, it's the health stigma and discrimination. Can you hear me? Did it come up? Yeah. And so writing, and so I referred to this, and then what I did was I created text in red that was unique to this grant. And I know that remember I told you it takes 300 hours? Because I care about the way that that looks. I created every single part of that from another figure and I modified it a little bit. And then I was building on intersecting stigmas. So I put in anything in a different color that was sort of new stuff to the grant so people could see what we were doing different within an existing framework. All right. That way you're showing that you're not doing the same thing that other people have done because they've created this framework from data. And so I'm focusing a little bit on what I'm trying to do here. No jargon. A lot of your reviewers may not be HIV experts or substance use experts or any of that sort of stuff. Use the right words and define them. And remember that, you're sometimes going to be having, a biostatistician, they have to use scientific language. And they know that, and I actually, when Denise is my biostatistician for probably 75% of my grants, and she writes it and all this, and she's really good at it, I go back and I rewrite it a little bit. I make it applicable and I put in some stuff that relates to the grant. So I always might get a section. And then of course I edit it and I send it back to her and she said, yeah, that's good. And then, like I said, I might actually have an example of a legend. Yeah, here's one. So I have a glossary of terms. And and if I had to write incarcerated persons or people, persons experiencing incarceration, I would take up half of a line every single time I wrote that. And that was a big part of this group. So I did that. Opioid use disorder. Anything that's 3 words or more, I think is probably fine to abbreviate. If it's 2 letters, I typically don't. All right. And so I try to spell that out. So these are things that just sort of kill you with regard to space. And I will put a glossary at the beginning. Make it appealing to the eye. If you can put in spaces between sections, it looks nice. You can't always do that. So what I do is I will highlight the first paragraph and I'll put 3 points if I have minimal space, or 6 points, so half a letter at the beginning of every paragraph. Some people try to hit a return. Too much. That's too much white space. But you want to make it appealing. So anything that you can break up in terms of an idea, it's better to cut than to cram. do not play with the spacing, the condensing of space in your grant. They have programs now that read your grant the day you submit them, and they send it right back to you and they say, you're cheating on your spacing. So I used to do that. I used to be famous for it and I got caught. And like I said before, when you can, break up the page with figures. So here is what a page looks like from a couple of, my grants. So I've got this table that you saw before. I've got a map that shows where all of our clinics are, and I've divided them up. I mean, I created that map with ArcGIS. So you can do this so that, it looks like there's a lot of tools out there so you can create nice figures. And then this is one that we created. There was one that was in a manuscript that looked like a piece of junk, and we revised it and made it look sort of a little bit nicer, but it explained what was going on. So just to sort of give something that looks like it's a little bit different than just a ton of text, you can imagine that if you were sort of having that across the entire page, you'd want to kill yourself. There's not even a paragraph separation. You don't get that down to here, but see where I put a little bit of space here? I didn't put a full line in between. I did a half a line with 6 points of the spacing beforehand. This is what I said before about the number of applications. Don't write and run on sentences. Even if people give you sections of the grant, it needs to be written with a single voice. I have read grants where I know that there are 3 different people putting in sections on the grant. I'm writing a big grant right now with 3 institutions, and every single one of the PIs on it are powerhouses. And we all have strongly opinion. We made a decision that one of the 3 of us has got to go back and rewrite it with their style so that it reads in a sort of a consistent sort of style. So that's really important to do that. And it needs to be, like I said before, engaging. I might say, even at the end of my specific aims, I will say, this grant is significant because its innovation is high, because I use this maybe 6 lines to summarize significance, innovation, once again, that repetition, feasibility. It's feasible because these people have worked with people who inject drugs for 1,000 years combined, in terms of their experience, and its public health impact will be this. That's my summary at the end of all my specific aims, because that reminds them at the end that that's what we're going to be telling you the details for. Try not to refer people to too many other places in the grants if you can. Sometimes you have to. When you have 2 aims that are related and you're using the same method, you can refer back to that method, but don't do that a lot. Your hypotheses should be clear. So is this a good hypothesis or not? Why? Raise your hand, tell me why. Not clear. How much? How much improvement? Improvement in what? Exactly. We hypothesize that nutritional advice, that is giving somebody recommendations, so this is part of implementation science, and the ingestion of 7 vitamins per day or per week that's consistent with recommendations will correlate with an amount, 50 CD4 count increase in people with HIV who are in a specific target range over a time period. It needs to be time bound. It needs to be quantified. Otherwise, it's aims. These are specific. All right. I try to put my outcomes into these aims. Why are they not funded? If they're not organized, people are all over the map. And that's why I give out my grant, because I can tell you I follow the same formula every single time. Once you have a winning formula and it's repeated, not just once, It is the way to do that. So I look at other people's applications. There's some examples online as well. A lot of times people are just proposing something that's already been done before. That's why you're scoping review and your systematic reviews, and you need to pull out what it is that you're doing that's different. Don't start out and say, this is my idea. It has to be your idea because there's a gap. All right. Um, do not make it look like you're doing a fishing expedition. All right. Oh, I'm going to go grab all of this data and I'm going to analyze it and we're going to see what happens from this. I'm going to define these variables in these way and I'm going to amortize this. I'm going to create alternative variables and all of that sort of stuff. It needs to be extensive, and it cannot be descriptive. Nobody's going to, at the NIH is going to fund a descriptive study. They have moved away. There's one whole section on cohort studies where you can do that. But I can tell you that they're not going to let even if it gets a good score, they're not going to give it funding unless you're doing some kind of intervention. That's just where the world is right now. And so give people a future direction. We're going to find out this, and now what? Make sure that it's a high priority, sort of area. So if it's HIV and their viral load suppression, it's got to be something of interest. The approach is a place where I think they kill you the most. They will find a million things wrong with your grant. I have gotten grants that have gotten between a 10 and a 15, which is almost perfect, where the one place that they still manage to write a lot of stuff down is the approach. And they're just telling us with ways that they think I can do it better. And most of the time they're right. And so I learned from that, but that's where they're going to find things because everybody's got a bone to pick. Why are you using asynchronous, focus groups or something like that? But it's oftentimes, well, you haven't given us enough detail. Now, the other part that the reviewers are supposed to remember is you either have 6 pages or 12 pages. So you can't write on, ever. Where there's something that's standardized, we are using this following standardized instruments that have, sort of high validity. And then I can just name them. All right. But if I'm using something else, I'm going to make up a questionnaire. Boy, what's going to be in that? How are you going to come up with those questions? Are you going to do a factor analysis? So, don't just go in there and just say you're going to throw a bunch of stuff. Try to use validated things when you can, even if in the end you don't use it. Your reviewers have got to think that you're doing that. You might have a slightly better thing that you want to do, or you can justify it. You might need some preliminary data for an R01. You don't need it for an R21. You might say that you're going to recruit 10,000 people who inject drugs and nobody's going to believe you. So you have to have feasibility. Over ambitiousness, it's the term that it appears overly ambitious to me. I mean, and I sort of I do really hard, complex trials. So I don't believe that anything can't be done. But on the other hand, you're writing not for yourself, you're writing for the reviewers. And so you sometimes have to tone it back. Dato went, he was like, Rick, you're promising too much. Maybe you're right. We could do it. You just sort of kill yourself doing it. Methodological flaws. This is another place where they get you. And then, if your institution isn't going to be able to provide anything for you, they don't have it in there. My institutional pages are like 20 pages. I write down every major center data plans, how many offices, how big the library is. I mean, we have the second largest library in the world. So, I put that in there. I've got this whole, paragraph on libraries. Put it in there so that they can't get you. For new investigators, it's really the overtly ambitiousness. The new investigators get a special bonus. They're supposed to be more forgiving of you, not only in terms of the scoring. We're supposed to be more generous with our scoring. I'm not sure every reviewer does that. And then when the project officer gets your score, and if you're a 23 and their pay line is typically a 20, they'll say, oh, they're new, they're doing this or something like that. And they'll say, let's just make a reach and give it to them. And then if the plans are underdeveloped, it's just too loose, things are not tied together. They're supposed to give you a little forgiveness, but not a lot. And that's where they tend to kill you. New ideas, state your hypotheses, make sure that your methods are the right methods. Remember, Denise said, ask your research question, then decide your analytical approach, all right? Choose the best one that's there. I can tell you that, you know, if you're going to do a step wedge, justify it. If you're going to do an interrupted time series, if you're using a Cadillac design, then, you know, you're not going to be assailable, but what they'll say is that's not innovative. Anybody can do a Cadillac design. So you're not doing anything different. So was doing one study and I did a multi-phase enrollment on a cluster randomized trial so that there was actually Dato presented a different trial where we were taking advantage of what happens as successive people learn how to do things. You know, that was actually one of the things that they thought was good. In your budget justification, you want to buy a statistician and a data manager. If it's not there, they're not going to find it. They're not going to find it sort of appealing, and they're going to feel like you can't actually do the work. What's out there? These unsolicited grants, which means that they're not doing an RFA or an RFP. The RO1 is the Mercedes of all grants. Everybody is dying to have one of those. Very few people get them. RO3s are $100,000 for 2 years. They're small, little, quick and dirty little things. It's a good way to get started, by the way. You know, I didn't do that and I don't write them now because it's too much work. I like the big stuff, but it doesn't mean they're not important. An R21, I love these. These are nice little applications. They've got these R21/R33s, which are lovely. It's you do your R21 work, which is your pilot feasibility work. And then if you meet your timeline, the timeline is the key thing. If you meet your metrics at year 2, they just automatically give you the next 3 years to do your research. And it's a lovely way to do it, but not every mechanism. And F32 is for postdocs. A K01 is for a new investigator. The equivalent for physicians is a K23, so you have to see patients to do that. A K12 are these big institutional training grants where you might train pre-docs, postdocs, and even faculty members. And a K23 is for a new medical faculty person. For those of you who are not US citizens, really the only thing that's for training that's available to you are K43s. And anybody who really is in a good position to do that, you have to be moving into a faculty position. So you need to have finished probably either your PhD or a postdoc. Most of the ones that I've worked with typically will do a postdoc for 2 years and then they'll move into this so that they're independent. I have one person from Ukraine who finished her PhD. She came to the US, did her PhD, and then she immediately went right into a K43 and got it. But it's 5 years of support. And one of the things I heard is you all don't get funding. It gives you money for your salary and it gives you money to do research. So it really addresses what they don't have is they don't have the equivalent of the F32 that we have for US citizens. Here's a website. All these slides are going to be available. And Dato, these were the things that I was supposed to define for you earlier. I knew I'd get to them eventually. Almost nobody gets the grant on the first time through. I will tell you a really interesting story. I was this smart, aggressive, hardworking, young faculty member right out of my training, and I got my first RO1 the first time through. Slam dunk. I thought I was the cat's meow. And then I just got hammered and beaten to death because I could not get anything through. And what some of my own trainees tell me is they say, I got this grant and I got a 35, I'm out of here. You have to be resilient. This stuff, it doesn't usually work the way it happened with me. Now, I got punished. I eventually got a grant, but it took me like 5 or 6 more grants writing before I got through with the next one. The critical submission, you get 1 page to answer the questions, and you can just say, we agree, we remove this, or we agree, we have extended section X, blah, blah, blah. If you have 1 page, if you have a lot of comments that you have to address, you might need to be very, very short with your responses and refer to the section. If you need it in order to build up your, you don't have enough room in your 12 pages, you could use part of that Yep.
but
Yep.
double
Yeah.
same code.
Yeah. So a resubmission is that you've submitted this grant with this idea. They gave you comments on it and you say, I got an okay score. And I think I can answer and fix this with the comments that they made. And now I'm going to resubmit with it changed with a specific set of changes that you're going to put in that you get 1 page to describe. And most of my students send me back like a 3-page response. I said, okay, how do we get this down to 1 page? And I show them examples of that and stuff like that. But there are some styles to be able to do that. And I got news for you. If you fight with your reviewers, I mean, occasionally you do, but if you fight too much, they're going to say, oh, this snotty-nosed brat, and they're going to beat you up. So one of my tricky things when I'm not going to make a change is our team struggled with this issue and we had such debate. And we really believe that using this strategy is superior to A, B, and C for the following reasons. So you once say you took it seriously, you struggled. That's a great word to use. And that you agonized and you went through 3 alternatives and you went back with it. Now, you don't get to do that very often, and you can't do that at multiple responses. You probably get 1 per grant where you can just say you're wrong. And you never tell them that they're wrong. I mean, some of my really high quality researchers, they just get incensed and say, oh, the reviewers are an idiot. I said, you can't say that. They might be an idiot, but no, you can't say that. Because you're likely to get the same reviewers. And if you're not going to get all of them, you're going to get 2 out of 3. It's a standing committee. All right. So you're going to see them again and they're going to get to see the summary statement. So you can't just say, we're going to not address that. You got to address every single one of them so that they say, because there's a whole section for resubmission that says their responsiveness to the critique. And they're going to come back and say, oh, they did a really good job. Or I don't think they really did what I asked them to. And they won't tell you exactly what to do to fix it. They just say, this strategy is a weak strategy or something like that. And of course, you want them to tell you why it's weak, but they're not oftentimes going to do that. If you have a score that's not reviewed, in other words, it's outside of the top 50%, I will never do a response to the reviewer. I submit it as a brand new application because I don't want to go in from an F minus because I might get to a C. All right. So I rewrite the whole thing and I put it in as a new application so that I don't have to respond to all of their reviews, especially if there's too many. Think about what it is. If they don't think it's important, you're going to have to beef that up or you're going to abandon your idea. If they just say, we already know this answer, do not resubmit that. They're just going to say you're flogging a dead horse. If, however, the objectives or the aims were slightly weak, strengthen them, maybe change your trial design or something like that. Always think about whether it's fixable. And theoretically, the reviewers are not supposed to tell you how to fix it. If you get me as a reviewer, I'm going to tell you. If I like your grant, if I don't like your grant, I might be very generic because I'm just going to say, I'm sorry, this has already been done. I don't think it's going to add any more literature. And then I don't want to see it again. I really don't. But for most of them, people work really hard. I would say that 90% of the applications that I read are, by the time they get into the review processes, are probably worth getting somewhere because people aren't going to waste 300 hours. So I typically try to tell them how to fix it. And, I don't say, change your variable to this, just say, the variables might be simplified or something like that. So I give them at least a direction on how to do it. That's not what you can expect from everybody. That's just because that's part of my mentoring. I believe that reviewing is a mentorship process. The NIH isn't the only place. We've gone through this. There's a ton of places that give money, and I'll tell you, I will take money from anyone. I am an equal opportunity grant prostitute. And, I will take it from private foundations. I won't take it from people who have, who like, for instance, like, J.R. Reynolds, cigarette producers or anything like that. I won't take money from certain ones. That's just my own personal issue. So I'm a slightly discriminate, prostitute, but not much. there's a lot of agencies out there where you can get money, you can get linked to sort of other funding things and do pilot projects within them. Um, you may not have a grant office. I have a grant office that sends me a list of opportunities that they think that might be right to me every single month. So I get a list of things that are appropriate. And then there are NIH equivalents in Canada, in France, in Germany, in China. So, if you're willing, if you've got colleagues that work anywhere, I mean, I love to work with people, outside of it. Um, Government may have some sources. I know like in Peru, they have a Peruvian NIH. The private sector, that was one of the ideas about how to bring in more money. We sometimes, I had a rich donor in Malaysia give me $1 million, and, he didn't, he can't tell me what to do. He can give me a topic area that's, where we're aligned. We were able to do a lot of good work with that money. The nonprofit sector, these private donors, international agencies, work, if there's like an Eastern European, Central Asian project, if you can tackle onto it, I would, tack onto it, piggyback onto it, it's really, really good. Um, I'm going to be repeating some of this stuff because I think repetition is important, but make sure you're writing with self-confidence. I mean, when you read my grants, you're going to think that I have command of everything, even though I may not, but you write with that kind of confidence. You don't come across as arrogant. It's important to be humble, but you write with declarative statements that are really clear. I oftentimes read things, well, it may be this and it may be that. And that's just the way people think. As a clinician, I'm going to go for the top diagnosis that's not going to kill them. And then everything else I'm going to deal with if it doesn't kill them. All right. That's the way I write my grants. I go straight for it. A lot of people, and I would say I write with people who say, oh, no, you can't say this showed this. It may show this. They love to write like that. That's not my style. So you'll pick up your own style, and the other style gets funded also. But I'm just sort of telling you that I write with a fair amount of self-confidence. It should be hypothesis driven. Who are the stakeholders who might be interested? I'm doing a grant on dental disease and people with HIV. If you would have ever told me that I was going to be doing anything with dental work, but it's with alcohol use disorders and HIV, I'm interested in that population. So it was something that sort of was interesting, being realistic and, and come up with sort of alternative plans if things go poor. None of us could have written a grant like what happens during COVID. We just had to innovate at that time. Once again, is the project important? Cite the literature, go for systematic reviews, and where the systematic reviews don't align, show that. Or if the systematic review is this, but they limited studies to this kind of thing. There are, however, observational studies that show something different. You can do that. Be the strongest critic. I go back, the first thing I read in a paper is the methods. If the methods are flawed, I don't care what their conclusions are. I really don't. Look at the methods. If their systematic review is so narrow that it doesn't apply to what you want, then you have to say the systematic review shows this. But there are 7 studies that are not included in this that are observational studies that have a slightly different outcome. And I point out where there are discrepancies in the literature because that's the knowledge gap, right? That's where the knowledge gap is. You have to be imaginative. I write well. I have to say, I told you at the beginning that I was the worst writer in the planet. And my boss said that to me. I actually hired, with my own money, a professional book editor, not to edit my papers, but for me to submit my papers to them. They knew nothing about the topic, but they would read it and tell me how to write scientifically. It was the single best investment I've made. 15 years later, we were sharing a hotel room at an international conference, and I was writing something up, and I wrote it up. I stayed up all night and I wrote it, and the next morning he read it. This is the same person. And he goes, Rick, this is really good. I said, and? I mean, I've had a few RO1s at this point. And he says, I just assumed that you had a ghostwriter all the time because all of your stuff looks so good now. And I said, I spent money because you humiliated me in order for me to do better with this. And he said, I have to tell you, it's the single best investment that you made in yourself was how to actually write and to have people critically do that. That's part of my mentoring plan now as we build in sort of training. That's why Jen is next door. Ready? Are we out completely? No, no, if we're done, we're done. Let me skip through. There's a couple of things here. I'm just sort of repeating things on what to do. These are some, I was going to give some thoughts on some grants here. This R61 and an R33 is this new one that comes out. You have 1 year to do epidemiological work that is going to be high impact, that then goes into some intervention work. These are just in time things. So when like the war in Ukraine happened and all hell broke loose, how do you go in and do a quick epidemiological study and then respond to it? The R34 is a planning grant to get to an R01. They're 12 pages. They're really hard to do because they're somewhere between exploratory and actually getting the R01. They're a fair amount of money. They're a lot more money than the R21, which is 275,000. You're up over you're at 450 for 3 years of time. And then I talked a little bit about the R03. Do we need to leave right now or can I give them any time for questions? Oh, it's lunch. You all are welcome to go to lunch. Anybody who wants to stick around, please do. And I'll take questions from here if there are any. Yep. 2 quick questions. I can even repeat them maybe.
Two mics together cannot work. You should switch it off.
Okay.
Then
It's like walkie-talkie. Okay, So one question about the team members, except my mentors, who can I make my team member in this grant? And second, about the references and datas to explore the context in Georgia, for example, many datas you will find only in Georgian, even numbers in Georgia.
So the answer to the second question, it depends, and I'll clarify that. Your team members should fill a gap in being able to do either aim 1, 2, or 3. So for example, I no longer do mathematical modeling myself. I have colleagues in the UK who do that. So one of my co-investigators is going to be like Peter Vickerman, who's there because I will provide the inputs. I'm a good modeler. In fact, that was what my PhD was on, but I don't do that anymore. And so I will provide the input. So I'm a reliable input giver, and then he will do the modeling. So that will be a co-investigator. If you're not a good qualitative researcher, you might have someone. If you're, let's say, for instance, if you're going to get like a training grant, you might write something where you're going to need mentoring in qualitative or mixed methods. You have somebody. What they're doing is it's not all of your friends, it's people who fill a knowledge or ability gap to do that. Things that are in Georgia that you want to do is you really want to generalize where it's possible, or at the end of it, say that the lessons learned here have great applicability elsewhere. And there are going to be reviewers who are going to kill you in that area. But let's just say, for instance, if Georgia has got the highest rate of cervical cancer, in the world or something like that, and nobody is getting treated like what the data that Sten Vermund presented yesterday, then what you're going to do is we're going to try to come up with innovative ways to overcome that might be applicable to other LMICs. And we could do it because we have the most of it. Not because we're going to fix it for Georgia. We've got the most of it, so it's more feasible for us to do it than other people. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
Thank you. Brief introduction. I represent Croatia International Foundation. We are non-governmental, non-profit. We work in health system strengthening and research. And Actually, I will not mention the university in the US, but we have written the R34 and we've got to the second round, actually, I think. And I was just yesterday working on the research capacity. So they asked about our research capacity as we partnered with the university. And even though I already sent it, I still have a little time to make changes. So do you have any suggestions how to approach this?
So if you're a non-governmental organization, I would not only talk about your capacity as an organization, I would talking about like projects that you all have been successful with. Any of those that have been translated to publications, I would talk about your partnerships with academic institutions. And if you have people within your organization who have special research skills, I would sort of, outline, that sort of thing. You know, I work, at least in this part of the world, a lot of times with research NGOs like DATO's research NGO, or in Ukraine with the Ukrainian Institute on Public Health Policy, because that's the way the world is. And so I would sort of write up that part. In Georgia, there is a strong research NGO imperative and mandate for that, because less of that is done by universities. And one of the reasons is the university sees itself in this part of the world as teachers. It's pedagogical, right? Now they're moving in that direction somewhat, but that's not the way it is. State that right up front, that's why it's important to work with research NGOs. So your capacity, and then list all the stuff that you've done, projects, funding sources and stuff like that. Those are free pages. You can write as many damn pages as you want. So kill it. Yep. Okay. So I added nothing, but that's okay. You just got confirmation.
Hello, it's Eka from Media State University. I have a question about the thesis, so the research question, and how to make it more detailed. For example, when it comes to the new subject to be implemented in Georgia, and there is no specific local resources to rely on, it's really difficult to provide some details what we are research and what is our specific objective to reach. So what would you suggest, particularly when it comes, for example, implementation of artificial intelligence capacity and capability to support decision making, let's say. So it's very broad, but yeah, I'm really open.
So one of the things I said before is don't reach beyond your expertise. So for instance, if you want to do AI and you're good at AI, go for it. If you're good at clinical decision support, but you don't have the AI, go for it and bring in an AI person. I'll give you an example. I have been developing mobile apps and chat bots and all kinds of, mHealth, UHealth sort of stuff for many years. And in fact, we have a whole company that we do that. And I work with engineers to do that. I'm not the engineer. I bring the engineer in. When I started doing AI, we have an informatics department. I'm part of that informatics. I reached out to a researcher who does machine learning and natural language processing to come into our group to work specifically on that grant. So bring together the right expertise in order to do that. Now, if you can't demonstrate the feasibility, in other words, if you can't convince the reviewers that it's feasible because you can't get the people in the healthcare system to adopt or to try this, you're going to be dead in the water. So you have to create relationships with those sorts of folks, but you really have to convince the reviewers that it is going to be feasible. The exploratory work doesn't get you into as much trouble, but when you're doing your intervention work, you got to show that you can, work with folks. And you can't put your aim is to learn to work with hospital systems on their AI, sort of work. You're going to have to sort of really show that you've got the connectedness and the expertise in order to answer a research question. And then I would say if it's because it doesn't exist in Georgia, maybe look outside of Georgia. If the question is important, move, not you physically, but work with collaborators where you can do that. I'm doing a whole study in the state of West Virginia, which is, a 2.5 hour flight for me. I do a lot of it with, with Zoom calls, and I make site visits 3 times a year. So I was doing rural health. I live in the Northeast, the urban Northeast. So if I want to do a rural health intervention, I had to work with people who were there. And of course, I work with everybody else in the country and around the world because I do global health. Did I answer that question or did I miss it? I'm on, sorry, yeah.
So the first, your suggestion is already met because I already have these people around. We are working with Robert Koch Institute. So, but the thing is that we do not have the local resources for evidence-based justification in order to make the hypothesis more detailed and based on smart indicators. So that was my question was more technical.
I think unfortunately you have to figure that out because it won't cross that first line unless you cross that. That's a no starter, I think, unfortunately. Yeah.
Maybe last question.
Mari Buziashvili, researcher with the National TB Center. My question was, what you just talked about, that kind of partially answered my question regarding pulling together an expert team. But from the perspective of a reviewer, so when a grant application of a new investigator comes in, do they pay attention whether there are some kind of big names in a collaborators list, or does it impact on a decision-making kind of? Yeah, thank you.
The real issue is that the reviewers want to know that there is an experience in doing the work. Now, there's sometimes a trade-off. So if you get some of the big names, and unfortunately everybody know who they are, they will be a name only. And so we call those shadow investigators. You do not want shadow investigators. If you look at my portfolio on paper, I've got 7 R01s. I work on several different continents. And people on paper would look at me and say, he doesn't do anything. But I think Dato can sort of attest to the fact that I actually get the work done. And people in the field know that because I publish all of that stuff. But there are many people out there who are, pedagogical, famous people. I mean, they're like, they're my heroes, but they're not going to do any work with you. So think about that trade-off because you really want to learn and you want their expertise on, those sorts of things. I had a guy in decision-making.
7 hours, all good.
Well, my last one just ended 2 weeks ago, so I'm down to 6, but yes. Ongoing R01s at one time. But what happens is people like to use the word this investigator, and they've said it up to me, not to me, but like if I'm on somebody's grant, they'll say he seems overcommitted. And on paper, I look very overcommitted. So you sort of need to think about whether they have a track record. Now, I have a strong mentoring sort of ability, so it might look okay, but that's where you have to sort of shore that up. But do try to choose people who have a track record. They do have to have a track record, but also that they show that they're committed. And it is a trade-off. I have some young people who I feel like got punished by having me on their grant. And I still, I make the time. I mean, I can't tell them that I only sleep 4 hours a night because they're just not going to buy it. But that's how I'm able to do it. But justify it. The letter of support. I have time to do this. I have just reduced my sort of time here. I have 38 people in my team who are doing a lot of the day-to-day work that I don't have to do so that I can do those kinds of things. And so you just have to make sure that you can convince the reviewers. And when you look at somebody with as many grants as me, you either run from them or you justify them. Honest. I mean, I don't mean to, shoot myself in the foot, but I've seen it happen. Yeah.